there, I'm Danielle Ofrey, Editor-in-Chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and welcome to Winning Words, a celebration of the winners of the 17th Annual BLR Literary Prizes. We're so glad you can join us. This is the 42nd issue of BLR, and it's packed with amazing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, plus cover art by Rebecca Chamberlain. Today, we're going to start with nonfiction. BLR's Felice Buckvar Prize for Nonfiction was judged by Michelle Harper. The winner was the essay In My Head by Avra Aron. Honorable mention went to the essay Casualty by Emily Carter. We'll start with Avra Aron reading an excerpt of her essay In My Head, and then she'll be joined in conversation with BLR's nonfiction editor, Damon Tweedy. This will be followed by Emily Carter reading an excerpt of her honorable mention essay, Casualty.
You are 12 years old, and your mind is like a game of hot potato. Your thoughts are quick and jerky, and you need to get past them before you get burned. Close a cupboard, turn the page of a book, put on a jacket. Hop into bed, open the refrigerator, flick on the light. Stay too long on something, and that's it. Boom. You need to open and close the door 6 times before you can continue on with your life. Why? Because if you don't, your mother will die. Intellectually, you know that closing a door has nothing to do with your mother dying, but that's not the point. Your mother is going to die. The only question is how, and your brain dares you to pick the most disturbing manner. Maybe your mother will get hit on the head, the way she did when you were 8 years old, when she opened the freezer and a frozen chicken carcass came flying down and bonked her skull so badly that she started to bleed, and you had to call the nearest neighbor for help. And then later at the hospital, your father was laughing to the point of being hysterical. A flying chicken, he kept repeating. A flying chicken. Or will she get into a car accident on Alligator Alley? You imagine her body burned and twisted under the Toyota, her hair torn out from her raw and bleeding scalp. You will try to run to her, but the police will hold you back. Or what if your mother is somehow decapitated and you see her head and her body lying on the ground in separate places? Your mother's brown eyes will be wide, and she will look almost surprised. Her mouth will be open, as if she is trying to take in a breath of air, her lips still coated in Desert Rose Elizabeth Arden lipstick. But her neck will be leaking, streaming, gushing blood with nothing connected underneath. It will technically be possible to carry her head around in your hands. You want to unplug your mind, but the only way you can is by opening and closing the door 6 times. And is that really such a terrible price to pay? So you do it. But if every day is a race, by bedtime, everyone else in the world is crossing the finish line while you're still at the beginning, retying your shoelaces. Why don't other people flick light switches up and down an even number of times before entering a room? Why don't they touch the corners of their math textbooks again and again until they touch them in exactly the right place? How can they turn on faucets and pick up telephones and pull sweaters over their heads without thinking about it at all? Why are you the only one who is stuck?
So welcome, Avra. It's a pleasure to talk with you today. Your essay was wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really honored you think so, and thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting.
Yeah, so just tell us a little bit about, sort of what went into it. How long that process was that you writing it, when you started writing it, sort of how it might have evolved. Tell us a little bit about all that.
Sure. So I guess I started writing this my junior year of college, which was back in 2008. And it's gone through many iterations since then, of course. It's quite different from how it started out. But I guess I started writing this because OCD is something that was a big part of my life for a very long time. And I kind of wanted to write it just to feel understood, because I guess with people, even with the best of intentions, sometimes with OCD, they only kind of see the tip of the iceberg. They only see the compulsion, the physical action. And what I always found most troubling was in my head. And so I wanted to kind of write down what was in my head. And so I started to write that in college. And although I knew this was very important for me to write about, for some reason I couldn't, it didn't feel like a complete story. And so I would put it away and then take it back out, and then put it back away for a couple months and then take it back out again, until something finally clicked. And I think what made it click is I had been writing in the first person, saying, you know, I am 12 years old, this is what I'm doing. And for some reason, changing all those I's to U's just made the story flow more in my mind, and made it come together.
Yeah, and also in some ways brings the reader, that second person version sort of brings the reader into your space in a different way. It's like, you know, you're trying to imagine yourself in that role. Yes. So it sounds like your writing it was in some ways for your kind of better understanding for yourself. Sometimes people write about these subjects to bring awareness to others as well. You mentioned that a little bit. Can you say a little more about that?
Oh, sure. About bringing awareness to others. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes. When I was growing up, and in the time that the story kind of details, when I found out there was something different about me, and at first I didn't know the name of it, but I just knew I was very ashamed of it. And so what I did is I tried to hide it. And sometimes I was more successful than others. But the thing that was ironic is that the more I tried to hide it, and the more successful I became at hiding it. I mean, if I was out shopping in a clothes store and I had the compulsion to touch different shirts, I would just pretend I was comparing the fabrics. And so the more successful I became, then when I came out with it and said, this is what I have, a lot of times people didn't believe me. They thought I was exaggerating, or they would say, oh, I get it, I have OCD too, because I like my bookshelf to be organized by color or something like that. And so I just thought that people didn't really understand what it was, and because they didn't understand what it was, in a way they didn't understand me, because a lot of my identity at that time was kind of interwoven with having OCD. And so I wanted to kind of explain it as slowly and as clearly as I could, what day-to-day life is like in the mind of someone with OCD, so that others could really understand it.
Yeah, so in some ways, you know, it feels like the labels like OCD or ADHD, they kind of get, you know, put around, and people sort of use them in sort of a casual way, like you know, as you sort of alluded to. And it sounds like what your essay was quite intense, and it really sort of puts you right in the sort of in the thick of it. And so, you know, as someone who works in that field, I just want to say, as someone who works in that field, this did wonders of really helping me understand. You know, I've had people come and talk to me for years, but this really sort of helped me put it into their mind. So I think in some ways it's as a real, you know, service, you know, even in a broader way.
That really means a lot to me, because I do know what you do. I do know you're a psychiatrist. So thank you very much for saying that.
Yeah. I wonder. So now you've talked about it a little bit in the past tense. I'm wondering, just wanted to hear a little more about that. So how do you see that now? You just curious.
Right, of course. Well, what happened, it was interesting after, it was when I felt having OCD most intensely, I guess, was in elementary school or middle school or high school. And then once I left for college, although, you know, and I still, you know, I still have OCD, I'll have it forever, I believe, but instead of it kind of being loud music blasting constantly, now it's kind of down to a hum. And I'm not sure why exactly that happened. Maybe it was being in a different environment, perhaps, I think, or maybe it was in college I was able to do things that were more creative. I studied acting, I studied writing, and I think having an outlet for that creativity really helped. But, and also what really helped was doing research about OCD and understanding it. And so I remember very specifically the day I learned that, I read that when you have the temptation to perform a compulsion, once you do so, the brain kind of sees it as a learned behavior that the brain knows will make that person feel better. And so the next time it's harder to resist that. And so once I kind of read that, I knew I was doing myself harm, because in the past I'd say, well, I can close the door 6 times. What harm will it do? And once I knew that was causing myself harm, it really did become a lot easier to stop. And so the more I learned about it, the more movies I saw about it, the more I read about it, the more I understood it, the more it kind of became a little bit easier to resist.
Yeah, that's great. And it was interesting how you describe in your essay how in these efforts you make, like if someone sees you doing something, you sort of are able to have an alternative explanation for it. And in your essay, you describe several times where it seems like it could very well be plausible, and then other times maybe not as much. And so sometimes, your parents sort of came into the story in that way. And so I'm curious to tell us a little bit about that. And it seems as if your parents sort of had kind of maybe differing, perspectives on it. So just bring us a little bit into that world of your efforts to sort of try and, blend in, but then, or make it seem like it was something normal in some way, but yet, there was a sort of idea that maybe it wasn't in other ways. I'd love to hear more about that.
Right. So, I think in some ways, especially when out in public, for some reason, it was easier to come up with excuses. It's kind of like being in a constant improvisation class. You have to justify anything, and you can make anything work with enough practice. Yeah. But sometimes, especially, I guess, if I was tired and I'd still offer an excuse, but it just is so implausible. No one's going to fan the door. No teenager's going to fan the door 40 times to try to loosen the hinges. So I guess, and I'm not sure, I guess, from my parents' perspective, I think that perhaps, I was working very hard not to admit to this. That's the last thing I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And so I think in some ways it was plausible to believe, in some ways it was easier to believe. Mm-hmm. And I guess depending on what I was doing, it wasn't. But I think even if anyone would see me doing something and they wouldn't believe my explanation for it, for that time, it would be another 20 times that I would have come up with the perfect explanation. Right. Did that answer the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. What was the process like writing it? Now, you mentioned how you started in college and it evolved over some years. So you said you had gotten to a place where you sort of had felt like you've gotten sort of, better handle on things in many ways. You told us about that. What was it like to sort of revisit that earlier time in your life in that way? And just in terms of actually the writings of it, right? And sort of going back to that earlier time.
Right. Well, I was really glad that I started writing this particular essay in college, because it had been a time that was very close to the time that is detailed in this essay. And so I was able to really write about it in detail, which is what I really wanted to do. I wanted to, as I said, I think, speak as slowly and as clearly as I could on this. Mm-hmm. And so I was very happy that I had all that specificity that I could put into there and all that detailed stuff. And then I guess it was nice to kind of have that distance from it as well. So I think that's kind of what helped the story come together in the end, and being able to kind of take a step back from it as well. But when I reread it now, I can still remember very clearly exactly doing all of those things, because I did them all day, every day. And perhaps, and also I've read this essay many times since, and so I don't feel it's something that I would ever be able to forget. But perhaps that's not true, or perhaps I would have written about it in a different way had I not been so close to it at the time. And I remember writing about those compulsions. In a way, it was hard to write because I wanted to make it interesting. And for me, having OCD has always been so excruciatingly boring, having to think A, B, at, and there's nothing more boring. And I wanted to make it interesting. And so that part was hard to write, but it was also really easy to write because I was just writing what was going on in my brain.
Right. You mentioned how in your mind it was boring, but as a reader, it sort of just kind of really sucks you into that story, into one person's orbit, into your orbit. What do you think others who maybe knew you in high school and college and in earlier periods of life, if they read this now, or if they do read this, how do you think they might react?
Well, that's an interesting question.
How do you hope they react? Both questions.
Oh, wow. I don't know. I think that I've always been a little bit different, which now I've come to embrace now that I want to be a writer, and then I've studied acting. I know the differences are kind of what make you special, and what makes someone want to read your work or want to see you act. It's your perspective. But I guess at the time I was always kind of a strange kid. In college, that strangeness just changed to quirky. I was the quirky actress, and so I guess in a way it wouldn't be that surprising. But I don't think anyone really knew quite the complexity of what was going on in my head. And so I guess how I hope they react is, I don't know, I hope it opens kind of the door for, I think a lot of times it's hard for someone to see someone else's perspective unless it's something they can see with their own eyes, exactly. or unless they've lived it themselves. And so I guess, and that goes not just for having OCD, but for a lot of things going on in the world today. And so I guess I hope that they can react with understanding, and not just for me, but for the next person who comes across their path who happens to maybe be a bit different.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the compulsions are what often draws people's attention, in like on television and popular, but it's harder to convey what the thoughts are that sort of driving it, and I think you did a really eloquent job of doing that. So I hope that certainly I hope that people will take away that experience in a very different way, and then maybe they'll think, wow, she's able to sort of manage all that and still do so well. So I think that hopefully there's some empathy, but also some admiration sort of thrown in there. That's certainly how I took that. So I just want to thank you. For sharing this with us, and I wish you all the best in your future writing. Speaking of which, anything else? Sort of, what's next for you in the writing space, in the acting space, these sort of things?
Well, I'm always working on essays. For some reason, I just feel real affinity for nonfiction. I read fiction and poetry too, but most of what I just kind of devour is nonfiction. And so I'm working on essays, and I guess most of them kind of deal in one way or another, some more obviously than others, on this idea of normality or of belonging or of fitting in many different ways. And so I found it a bit harder, much harder to write during COVID in these times, being isolated a bit. But I am working. That's what I'm working on next.
So we look forward to it, because I could certainly see, writing in the nonfiction, but even in the fiction space, the way that you wrote that, it shows a lot of creativity and just craft. So I'm wishing you all the best moving forward, and looking forward to the future.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you.
Sis and I had 3 brothers and 39 cousins, 25 of whom were of the male persuasion. In a farm family that ran wild and free, playing army, riding horses, and damming creeks, being a girl could be a disadvantage. It's not hard to pin a girl down and keep her quiet with a breathy threat in the ear. Simple to cup a crotch, expose an erection, explore budding nipples, especially when you're taught early that the only crime of punishment is that of the tattletale. This isn't exclusive to my generation. It went on before and continued after. Observable, acceptable behavior reinforced what would be tolerated within the halls and walls of a family. And not all were bad. Some were the best kind of boys and have grown into good men, solid husbands, amazing fathers. But the minority that caused harm kept harming. It's a deliverance kind of tale. Something happened, no doubt, something horrible happened somewhere in the darkness, and it was pushed down and covered by leaves with sis at the bottom of the pile. In my lineup of the malevolent hands and intentions who hurt sis, certain mug shots flash into view. It makes sense that these would later be the ones who crusaded against her, solidifying the importance of reducing sis to a drug addict and lunatic, weakening her credibility and stature should she ever muster the courage to file her charges. It's easier to defame the victim than attend your own trial. Even with my suspected people of interest, how do you gather the facts and bring justice for someone who fancies herself courted by Charlton Heston? How does someone with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder take the stand with believability? And of the few who knew the truth, so little could be trusted. There's no statute of limitations on affairs of family or heart. The justice side of me hopes that the guilty lie awake, unable to reconcile Sis's long and painful fall. Our formative years linger, shaping us. Experiences, both traumatic and redemptive, are part of our stories. There was a summer, the one with frogs in the treehouse, and I wish I could transport us there. If we could just go back to before what was already spinning spiraled us all down the drain, then maybe it would all be different. Maybe what was broken in Sis would have been under warranty and could have still been repaired. I have a sister. Once upon a time, she was smart and beautiful. Illness, drugs, confusion, pain, and trauma broke her. But she isn't gone, nor is she forgotten. This is part of her story as best as I remember. I love her completely without complete understanding. I count on grace to fill in the gaps.
Thank you, Avra. Thank you, Damon. Thank you, Emily. We'll now turn to fiction. BLR's Goldenberg Prize for Fiction was judged this year by Amy Hempel. The winner was the story Step Down by Nitin Ahuja. Honorable mention went to the story Pale, Unhappy Dog by Angie Sijun Liu. Nitin will start us off by reading an excerpt from his story, Step Down, and then he'll be joined by BLR's contributing fiction editor, Ronna Wineberg. They will be followed by Angie Sijun Liu, reading an excerpt from her honorable mention story, Pale, Unhappy Dog.
I don't mind the night shift. I'm still new here, granted, so it doesn't really matter whether or not I mind it. I suspect I'd have a harder time on the general wards, where nights are really just a babysitting gig. But not in the step-down unit, where the patients are all sick in a steady but uncertain way, suspended between the floors in the ICU, waiting for the course of an illness to reveal itself. The lights are dimmed through the early morning hours, and the cardiac monitors keep softly beeping. I spend most of my time with a pleasant sense of calm and capability, holding in my haunches the energy of a weighted spring. The best compliments I receive from my colleagues are in this spirit. You're so level-headed, Russell. Or, if I was ever in here, Russ, I'd want you to take care of me. I try to accept this praise with an ample dose of self-deprecation, or else false swagger that serves the same basic purpose. God help you, Marge, or you should be so lucky, Marie. It isn't lost on me that I stand out in other ways. Male nurses at this hospital are few and far between. They skew either young and effeminate or old and foreign. Visitors who stop me for directions in the lobby usually mistake me for a doctor. With my back half turned toward a cabinet or computer, I sometimes feel my coworkers' eyes on me, lingering with the sort of idle curiosity that I assume drives zoo patrons through the lesser exhibits, where the animals aren't beautiful or dangerous, just rare enough to be interesting. Mostly I try to ignore this difference of mine at work, but sometimes it's inescapable. Like last night, when I was assigned to Joe, a 20-year-old frequent flyer with cystic fibrosis, well known for his recurrent drug-resistant pneumonia and reliably inappropriate behavior with female staff. At the 7 p.m. handoff, his day nurse Megan gave me the highlights from her shift. The IV line that blew in the middle of Joe's antibiotic infusion, the way his hand had lingered on her thigh while she replaced it, the steady improvement in his oxygen requirement, his repeated request for a sponge bath. I went to Joe's room first, where I found him asleep with one arm and one leg hanging off his mattress past the bed rails. His oxygen tubing had gotten twisted around his neck, knocking the nasal prongs out of position, forcing me to wake him. "Rise and shine, boss," I said, then louder, "Hey, Joe." He groaned into his pillow and started coughing. I helped him up, leaned him forward. Shit, Joe said when the fit had subsided. Where's Meg? Done for the day, I said. I'm taking over. Raw deal. No offense. None taken. I hung a fresh bag of saline on the pole. My other 2 patients were located in rooms on either side of him. Mrs. Wood, an old lady with heart failure, and Mrs. Vine, an old lady with cirrhosis. Last names down here seem to borrow often from common nouns. Aspen, Baker, Cotton, Dove. Maybe it's a Southern thing, I'm not sure. If I asked around, I bet I could find some fellow Pennsylvania transplants with whom to compare notes. But I'm just as happy figuring things out on my own. In the step-down unit, the sliding doors are made entirely of glass, and walking past them at night, I sometimes imagine myself in a museum of natural history, looking into dioramas of representative specimens, their bodies twisted deliberately into postures of instruction. What sort of specimen was Joe? A hybrid form, restless even in stupor, all tangled up in the linens. A lattice of bone and sinew that hinted at the vigor it might have held. I exchanged an empty bottle of bronchodilators for a full one, turned on the nebulizer and gave Joe the mask. While he inhaled, I updated the dry erase board hanging just below the television, replacing RN Megan with RN Russell. Meg used to draw smiley faces, Joe said, his voice muffled by plastic. Don't talk, just breathe, I said. You want a smiley face? Not from you. At the bottom of the board, I drew 2 stick figures wearing cowboy hats. Neither was smiling.
Welcome, Nitin. I'm so happy that you're here and that we're going to have a chance to talk with each other.
Thank you, Ronna. It's great to be here.
Great. I wanted to first start with your beautiful story, Step Down. The story is powerful and moving. It's also shocking and sometimes a little bit disturbing and tough, which makes it wonderful for a reader, and the reader is really immersed in the world you create. When you and I spoke yesterday, you said that this is your first piece of published fiction, plus it's a contest winner. You've published many essays that you've written in many journals. What inspired you to write this story?
Thanks for the question. I think for me, it's more a question of sort of what inspired me to shift from nonfiction to fiction, as opposed to this story in particular. I mean, certainly there were ideas in this story that motivated me, but I've been a reader of fiction for a long time and have really enjoyed it, but also been sort of intimidated by it. The blankness of the page feels especially blank with fiction, but at the same time, it's really generative in a way that I was excited to explore. So I tend to write about medical themes, and it was a slow and uncertain process, but I'm excited with what I came up with.
How long did you work on the story? You said it was a slow process, but exciting.
Yeah, it was months. It was in the first full year of the pandemic. I remember working on it in bits and pieces. And certainly a process of revision too. So the first draft of the story was quite different than what I ended up with.
You're a gastroenterologist and you're on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania. So you have a lot of experience with medicine and patients. Did any of your own experience make its way into the story?
I don't know that anything specific made its way into the story by way of anecdotes, but certainly the mood of the hospital, particularly from when I was a trainee and more disposed to inpatient work and off-hours shifts, made it into the story, at least informed it. I think the mood of the night shift in particular was something that I don't know if it gets transmitted to the story, but something I thought about a lot in residency, the way that things quiet down and also get a bit stranger by virtue of the skeleton crews that are operating. And particularly when I was a resident, I felt like a very junior member of the team. And so the fact that it was mostly me and my colleagues, all the attendings had gone home, made it feel like a different sort of children's hospital, that the hospital had been ceded to the children. And so that also gave it a sense of ownership, but also a sense that anything could happen, that there was a little less supervision, a little bit more potential for things to go haywire.
And what made you decide to write this story from the point of view of a nurse as opposed to a doctor?
I think a little bit of that is what's hopefully generative about fiction, that you can embody a perspective that you don't yourself embody in real life. I mean, I think this is a fraught conversation right now, as we talked about yesterday, that there are responsibilities to embodied voices that aren't your own. But to the extent that the hospital or healthcare settings in general rely on people from multiple different roles, I guess, I'm humbled to the fact that I don't really understand what other healthcare professionals feel and see on a day-to-day basis. And so it was an exciting prospect to experiment with another voice, with another role.
And it might have given you a certain freedom to imagine, because you weren't really writing about your own role.
I think that's right. And to tackle themes that are interesting and maybe even taboo, I think that's one of the imperatives that I've tried to follow in fiction, that I felt sort of bound by nonfiction in being able to explore, like sort of taking ownership of negative affect towards patients, which we all kind of experience as healthcare providers, but you don't necessarily want to co-sign all the time. I think feeling negatively about your job or negatively about patient interactions is easier to do when you're throwing your voice. Likewise, this is a male nurse, and so questions about masculinity in the care setting and being a care worker, and how that accentuates or challenges maleness, I think was a sort of a provocative idea that I wanted to explore, and seemed to be crystallized more in the context of a nursing role. Not that it should be, but I'd been reading articles around the time of writing the story about quote unquote pink collar jobs and the fraughtness or the avoidance of those jobs by men. And so sort of exploring that tension was an interesting part of this project as well.
And it certainly came through in the story, what Russell, who's the main character, experienced as a male nurse, certain prejudice against him, which was very interesting because it's usually not written about. I wondered too, how you decided on this story's setting, the structure, because you deal with both the past and the present, and also the attributes of Russell himself, because he's so different from you, in terms of your education.
Yeah, I mean, those elements all kind of emerged as a patchwork too. It's been long enough that I can't remember the actual sort of process specifically, but I remember going on runs in the first part of the pandemic when things felt, everything felt sort of suspended. But those runs would be the times when I would add to the story sort of based on what I had written already. I think one of the reasons why I haven't tackled fiction as much as I might have in the past is that I have a really hard time moving plot forward, like coming up with things to happen. And so Those runs would be when I could make things happen, or at least would bounce around ideas of making things happen. But it was a slog still, so I'm not good at it. But to answer sort of specific questions about setting and character, I think it built slowly over time, and it was organized around sort of the themes that I wanted to address. So as they emerged, themes of liminality and hybrids, like things not being one or the other, the night shift being kind of a middle space, the step down unit being kind of a middle space, those kinds of ambiguities were things that I wanted to lean into. And I think that's how the character and the setting emerged.
Mm-hmm. Well, in this story, you certainly have a lot of plot in terms of what happens to patients. So it was successful in terms of that. You succeeded with plot in this story.
Thank you.
Even though it may have been a slog, which sometimes writing is. And I also wondered how you balance your writing with your work as a doctor and the work you do at the university.
Not ideally. I wish I balanced it better. I would like to be writing more. So I'm still striving towards like a healthy daily or weekly regimen of writing. That said, I'm really grateful for a job that offers a lot of substrate to draw from for writing. It feels a little bit one note, my portfolio of writing about health and medicine, but there's enough there that I keep coming back to it. So it's fodder for sure. And I should say it's bilateral too, that when writing is exhausting or when I come up against a dead end, it's nice to put my hands on a colonoscope and just be manual for a while in a different way.
So you can go back and forth, you have variety.
That's right.
And how long have you been writing? Is it a recent interest or is it something you've had for a while?
Pretty long standing. I was one of the sort of frustrated pre-meds who, was turning to novels and short stories for palate cleansing. So it's been a parallel interest for a while in terms of actually publishing essays and things like formalizing things for publication. That started in fellowship. So 7-8 years ago. But it's been a dream for a while. And so it's been nice to have alongside everything else clinical.
Well, I hope you continue it. And how was the experience of being edited, this piece of fiction? Because we did do a lot of editing on the piece.
It was great. I have experience with editors in the context of my non-fictional writing, and it's always a blessing to have the attention of a careful reader. With BLR specifically, I was struck with just the care that was taken at the level of the line, attending to how things cohere at the level of logic, but also at the level of sound. And at the same time, the gentleness with which the editing happens is not always the case, that editing is so light and so open-ended, like considered optional. So I was grateful for the combination of attention and autonomy.
Good. And I was grateful for your flexibility and willingness to work on the story.
Of course.
And
yeah.
finally, I wanted to ask you what you're working on now and what your hopes are for the future in terms of writing.
So I guess my essays, by virtue of my bad habits with setting a regimen for myself, have relied a lot on pitches. I will pitch an essay and then wait for a yes before I write it, with the sort of guarantee that, or sort of semi-guarantee that something will come of it. I think that's been useful to build a portfolio, but sort of limiting in terms of the things that you can write about. So lately I'm trying to write for myself a bit more creatively, sort of finish a piece and then see where it might find a home, which was the case for this story. And And eventually, I would love to turn my attention to something larger, but that requires more discipline than I have hitherto mustered.
Well, I hope you do tackle something larger and that you continue writing. We all at the BLR loved your story, and we're so happy that you submitted it and that it won the contest. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me and all of us. And I hope to speak with you again sometime, and I hope you'll send your work in once again.
Thank you, Ronna, and to the BLR. It's a huge honor. I'm really grateful for the showcase and for the confidence. Thank you.
Blindfolded, Maylin is slumped in a chair in the village square. The crowd gathers to witness her. Maylin's mother holds a razor in her hand, sharp with the absence of use. Girls A through E stand in the periphery of the circle, chanting a somber tune about a mischievous butterfly who is sentenced to relive its past lives. Her mother corrects Maylin's posture by placing her hand on the small of her back. All eyes are on Maylin, but Maylin has no eyes. This witnessing is not a reciprocal relationship. Behind her blindfold, she has no choice but to look inward, at herself. As her mother presses the razor into her skull, Maylin concentrates on the individual strands as they are shaped from her head, falling onto the ground like autumn leaves. The tourists each vying to take one home as a souvenir. A material trace of her will linger in the hands of strangers, a record of each day of her life contained in it, recursing back toward the beginning, her childhood, when there were many days just like the others, eating taro cakes in the rain, napping in the milk bright afternoon, the dew camouflaging the grass in unbearable ways. On the riverbank, Lee lights a cigarette and thinks about drowning in the abstract sense. The calmest part of the river is marked by a mossy stone egg the size of a semi-truck. Where the river hits the stone, the water ebbs into a deep pool. He imagines his motorcycle gliding across the surface of the water, taking him to refuge on the other side. Behind him, he hears the soft sounds of a crepuscular animal padding in the lichen. But when he turns to look, he sees Maylin running barefoot through the night, her head shaved close like a young boy's. "Where are you going?" she yells. She looks crazy. "I'm going to cross to the other side," he says, mounting his bike. "I said I would come with you," she says. He doesn't want to say the obvious thing, so he stares at her instead. "The women in my village cut their hair only once in a lifetime," she explains. "This year is my turn." In her baldness, he sees the whiteness of the rapids. "Will you miss it?" he asks. "Miss what?" "Having all your hair." She shakes her head with violence. "No, I hated it. It was so long." In that moment, he didn't think she could be more lovely. "Could I come with you, or are we saying goodbye?" she asks. But before he can answer, she mounts the motorcycle behind him and holds the fat on his stomach, dimpled on his waist. "Hold on to me more tightly," he instructs. "The water will be very cold." They could be mistaken for brothers now. Wherever he is, she is too. What he sees in her is not singular, but is not exactly plural either. Her form welds with his. If you were to separate them now, you would not end with symmetrical sides, halves of the same self. You would end with a border that circumscribes. He revs the engine. They lean into each other, ready to exit the life that they have learned to hypertrophy themselves inside, like a stone birth. The water before them is pure and dark. When they make contact with it, it doesn't feel so cold after all.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Ronna. Thank you, Angie. And now last, but definitely not least, is poetry. This year, BLR's John and Eileen Allman Prize for Poetry was judged by Crystal Valentine. The winner was the poem Drought Pastoral by Michael M. Weinstein. Honorable mention went to the poem 6 Weeks into Chemotherapy by Laura Paul Watson. We'll start with Michael Weinstein reading his winning poem, Drought Pastoral, and then he'll be joined in conversation with BLR's poetry editor, Sarah Sala. This will be followed by Laura Paul Watson reading her honorable mention poem, 6 Weeks into Chemotherapy.
I wanted you, desert, you red, incorruptible, parchedness perched on the earth's bone shoulder, songless as the hot wind sows through you, and the dump truck windows gleam like opened blisters at high noon. Today I heard the grass growing, whispering its one shared word, blade to blade, until the whole green lawn knew it. Guilt seeped up into me, droplet by droplet, until morning cast it off shivering every tiny globe. Which lives and which deaths do I own? A barrenness thrives in me. A flock of toxins feasts among the styrofoam takeout containers. My organs, sprawled in the sun, become. It happens so slowly. The kidneys' deliquescence, the wrist's 8 dinky bones ground to a powder that seeps into groundwater, granular as one egg in the slurry of my womb. To be holy is not to hope anything grows from this, I know. To stand impassive as a cliff's face formed when the desert rose up in grief millennia ago, and not expect nourishment or resurrection in a handful of rain. But I can't stop bleeding for the future as the automatic sprinkler seems to love the curb, casts its glistening veil of tears over and over it. Open up, desert, and let me down into you 7,000 feet. Where once the cage stops shaking, I can hear my lungs breathe. Where once your pleats of rock flesh clutched a silver seam for boys like me to rip and scrape the clots of bounty out. I want that dark igneous solace of just before they knew what we had in us.
It was so wonderful to hear you read that poem because I've imagined and read it out loud so many times, just what it would sound like to as you've intended it. So I love the musicality of Drought Pastoral. Lines like parchness perched on the earth's bone shoulder, and where once your pleats of rock flesh clutched a silver seam for boys like me to rip and scrape the clots of bounty out. It made me really aware of how language kind of like tumbles and turns in our mouths, right? And I also admire how the poem kind of juts down the page, like this beautiful rock formation. So I have to ask, like, how did this poem come into existence?
Well, thank you so much. That's really kind of you. Yeah, I think, well, it's funny. I think when I write poems, I do think of them as kind of construction projects, which is maybe one reason why I was drawn to the landscape of the excavation and the dump trucks and the mines. I tend to blow the text on the screen up to about 300% and kind of like almost like sculpting. Like I try to really treat each word as a material object and kind of collocate them together. So when you're that zoomed in, you end up having these very discrete blocks of text. And then hopefully it does end up kind of cascading, as you were saying. But it forces me to really focus on the particular words, so I'm happy if that materiality kind of comes through.
That's amazing. I've often thought of poetry as sculpting, but I've never blown a poem up that large to really look like on a granular level. That's really
I
cool.
think I probably look like a crazy person, but it's okay. My eyes are also getting worse, so
I was gonna say reading it 300% is probably helpful for me too.
Absolutely.
When you wrote this poem, did you have a feeling about it? Right? Like sometimes I write a poem and I'm like, I hope this poem will do something. Because it's amazing that Crystal Valentine picked it for the Allman Prize. Was writing this poem something that you had that feeling about, or were you just writing poems and putting them into the world?
Oh, it was so amazing and such a gift to have this poem be chosen for this prize. Both because I think that its themes align very much with
Mhm.
BLR, and also because, to be honest, I wrote a series of pastorals. I've been
Mhm.
interested, from a trans perspective, a crip, disability perspective, in ways of refiguring or rethinking embodiment,
Mhm.
like in line with what's happening in the natural world right now. And I came to feel that I had started to see my own body as a kind of landscape. So I wanted to rethink the genre of the pastoral sort
Mhm.
of through that lens. And I wrote a number of pastorals, which are all, part of a book manuscript now. And this one, I really had that good feeling when you write a
Mhm.
poem,
Yeah.
you're like, I had a teacher who once said, for every 99 poems you labor over, there's one that's kind of given to you.
Mm.
I sort of felt like this one happened after a long labor with other ones. But then when I tried to workshop it with friends, people were like, oh, I don't know about this. It didn't resonate with people that much. But I kept sending it out. And then finally, somebody, it found a home. So that was so wonderful. But yeah, I think the feeling I had was that that the images were allowing me to be very honest about a set of embodied concerns that I hadn't been able to express a different way. So it feels, like I said, like a gift to have someone say, yep, I see that. I got you.
Definitely, and I like how you're re-inhabiting and re-envisioning the pastoral also. Um, in just kind of looking around at your social media and things, thinking about your Twitter handle at Trans Poetics and things, and thinking about um, how different bodies inhabit different poems, right? And accessibility. I guess I'm really curious, like, who is your ideal audience, or who do you write for in a perfect world?
I would love to think that I write for anybody who is, open to reading it. And, for me, the stakes of writing poetry in a way that I think has to do with my embodied identities, but is not reducible to that.
Right.
The stakes of writing poetry for me are, how can we imagine, forms of embodiment and subjectivity, but also collectivity and
Mhm.
participation, like using the medium of language. So I think anybody who is invested in those questions, and who feels an urge to imagine their embodied life differently, I hope a poem like this could be for them. And it doesn't mean they have to think about those questions in the way that I've thought through them here. It's really just about wanting to and being open to imagining the world otherwise.
Absolutely, and I felt that going through the poem, right? Sometimes I think when we visit a poem, we're taught, line one plus line two equals line three, and there's that logic, right? That we're locked into. But your poem felt in a beautiful way of just being, and you can inhabit the poem, and we come in and out of images in this like wonderful logic of the poem. So yeah, it's a really wonderful experience to move through this poem.
Thank you so much.
So I'm really curious too. Did you always want to be a writer, or how did you come to be a poet?
Nobody has ever asked me that before. Yeah, I wish I could ask you the same thing. I mean, I think that writing poetry is a profoundly unnatural act for anyone, except for those of us for whom it is, like, paradoxically the most natural, or like the only natural way to kind of interface with the world. I think one thing that poetry helps me to do, in the face of certain kinds of bodily, limitation or difficulty, is to create a body of work that can stand in for the body, that can provide a set of alternatives to the body, um, that can treat language as a kind of medium in a way that helps me think about the body as a kind of medium, which is empowering, because that means you can also, transform and find new ways to inhabit that body. So I think probably that desire was always in me. But also, the one other thing I would say is that, a lot of things about, my family background, their immigration background, different experiences of language led me to think about language as a very precious thing, as a thing that you've got to use really well and maybe a little bit sparingly. The opposite of what I'm doing, blathering on to you right now. It's like you've really got to craft it and value it, you know? And so poetry was mysterious and exciting to me from a very young age, because it seemed like each word was sort of pregnant with this resonance and this mystery.
Yeah, and I see that economy of the line, but also bounty of the language as we move through too. Absolutely, that's really interesting. Who are some poets or artists? It could be any medium. Who do you admire, or who helps you nourish your own work or turn to, if you get stuck?
Oh, so many people. For the sake of time, I'll try to limit myself. Well, my oldest and earliest influence was W.H. Auden. So to the extent that I'm like, a stuffy old formalist, you can blame him. And Yeats, I grew up on those guys. So yeah, again, the discipline and the economy of the line, and like thinking, poetry as a mode of thinking or argument, I think comes from them. I love some more recent poets like Terence Hayes, Monica Youn, Jericho Brown, also the British poet Ali Hazard, who does these incredible sort of formal experiments. So the poem becomes a kind of lab experiment. And that connects back to, the modernist legacy that I studied in graduate school, and that's very close to my heart. So people like William Carlos Williams, or later John Ashbery, and of course, Elizabeth Bishop, who is, my homegirl, even though she wouldn't know it. I'm also very, very influenced by photography and film. And I love one of my scholarly work centers a lot on early Soviet modernism. So I love these moments where new technologies help poets and writers like reimagine relationships between people and things, or relationships between an individual political subject and, say, a revolution or a social movement. And so I look a lot to the visual arts to help me think through some of those things.
That's amazing. Yeah, I feel like different modes of creating nourish one another too. And it sounds like in your different, degrees that you have, your educational journey, I'm curious, like, how did that impact your writing? Did it push you and transform you in new ways? Did it give you more time to write?
It's really funny that you ask that now, because now that I am working a 9-to-5 job, being a working stiff, I'm like, wow, I had like 7-8 years of just, me with the bookshelf, like the one right behind you in that room. And that is just paradise, What would I say about that? Well, I guess I would say that I first became interested in studying Russian and later comparative literature because my mom's job involved working with Jewish immigrants in the Boston area where I grew up. My family is originally from Germany, so I was very drawn to her work with Russian-speaking immigrants. And I was supposed to teach them English, and they ended up teaching me Russian, and that was pretty cool.
That's amazing.
So I went on to study that, and that comparative and cross-cultural context, and especially the Slavic studies and Russian context, really influenced my work. And I think I know that you also have different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, so I think it is such a generative thing to come up against the hard edges of like a different language, and to try to enter the frame of mind or the cultural historical context of that language. So I am really influenced by a lot of Russian poets and thinkers and the ways that they approach language, and also the things that poetry has been historically used to do in that context. So maybe I'm a little bit utopian about it, but I am nostalgic for that relationship to poetry, where making art has real world social and political stakes. And I don't totally believe in it in our context, Sarah, but like I want to believe in it. So my poetry is an exercise in trying to believe in that.
I was gonna say, which leads me to like a great question with so much going on in the world right now, you know, with a pandemic, with wars waging, and you know, it's always been this way too. But I guess, what do you see as the role of poetry? You know, what can poetry do as part of this conversation? I know that's a big
Yeah,
question to ask.
yeah, it's a big one, and you know, it's one that I think a lot of us who, those of us who really care deeply about the arts and who teach and who try to, you know, because teaching is also the structuring of information to help explain things to people and help give them a place in what's happening now, right? So for all of us as writers and educators, I think that's a huge question. For me too, you know, as someone who's devoted the past 2 decades to studying Russian culture and literature, which is not my culture in a
Mhm.
native way, you know, obviously humanitarian catastrophe and genocide are horrible everywhere.
Right.
And I don't think that, you know, we should, you know, think differently about victims because of their race or their location or anything like that. But because of, you know, the years I've spent living in Russia and my closeness with it, this one hits different for me, you know? Um, and it makes me think that, about your question about what can poetry do? I don't agree with Auden that poetry makes nothing happen, but I
Mm.
think to the extent that it makes something happen, we also have to recognize its limits. So we have to say poetry is not actually the revolution,
Mhm.
right? The people who are being bombed are not writing poems.
Right.
They probably are not sure we should be talking about poems right now, you know? But I do think that there is a memorial function, a critical function, and
A comfort also.
a comfort and also like a form of shared experience that can happen only at the distance that
Right.
poetry is written from and that poetry gives us. And I don't necessarily think, the last thing I would say is I don't necessarily think that, you know, poetry is not simultaneous with atrocity, right? It can't be. But its belatedness doesn't have to be a limit. It can be a kind of affordance. It can say, okay, this is after the fact, but what does that distance allow us to see? And how does it allow us to cast a new light on this situation? And I think it can help us feel close to people whom we recognize we have very little in common with. You know, we're seeing that with the publication, for example, of works by Ukrainian poets, there is
Mhm.
a huge outpouring of not just, you know, political support, but resonance, like a
Mhm.
recognition of shared humanity that can
Right.
happen only after the fact and at a distance.
Yeah, that's really interesting that poetry is not necessarily simultaneous. That's what we have for journalism in other genres, right? So it is really
Yeah,
interesting, this distance, kind of time and accretion, reflecting, and like you're saying, the shared humanity. Like a poem is a container that we can pour our own experience into, and in some ways, really deeply resonate with others. Yeah.
absolutely. And it doesn't have to be so. A literary critic who was actually a teacher of mine a while ago, Svetlana Boym, she has a book called The Future of Nostalgia, and she writes about restorative nostalgia versus reflective nostalgia. I think
Mm.
this is really interesting because there are people, for example, the Make America Great Again model of restorative nostalgia, where it's like, this is our blood and our soil, and this is the way things were, and let's be nostalgic for that, and let's reconstitute that.
Hmm.
And then I think conversely, there's a way that poetry can kind of do historical thinking, cultural work, by saying we're not trying to restore what's been lost. We're trying to be reflective about it. We're trying to hold the past and the horrible present and the potential futures in our minds simultaneously and let those juxtapositions coexist. That to me would be like an ideal for what poetry could do.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. Is there anything else that I haven't covered that you want to put out there?
No, I mean, it feels so one-sided. I wish I could ask you about, you know, your thoughts on these questions and your work. But it's a small world, so maybe I'll get that chance some other time.
I would love that. Yeah. Michael, thank you so much. This has been really amazing. Reflecting on Drought Pastoral, thinking about the desert, and poets in all of our humanity in an ideal world. So I really thank you for this discussion today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a privilege. It's been great.
To be unseen, unprayed for, to be unhugged in the grocery store and left alone to select a melon, to be rooted against, discomforted, to receive no advice. God, let me be ordinary, invisible. Let me struggle in the usual ways. Stubbed toes, taxes, and inspire no one in my misfortune. To have all my misfortunes grow small, to be dull as a leaf. My neighbor lifts me to the Lord in the middle of the street, and one of us feels better. Oh, to be chronic, hairy, to add time to my own tragedy, to do the way I did. I'm a slick thing, sunken. I've set my nerves on fire. I've let go 1,000 birds inside this body. Oh, to be let go, to hold on to instead of being held. I want to do all the holding.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Laura. And I want to add a very special thank you to the Goldenberg, Buckvar, and Allman families who sponsor BLR's literary prizes. And I also want to acknowledge all the BLR editors and the reviewers who bring this wonderful writing to the page. And especially a thank you to all of the writers who contributed to BLR's 42nd issue. If you haven't gotten your copy yet, please visit us at www.blreview.org. You can browse BLR's previous events, you can read poems, stories, and essays from older issues, and we hope you'll join the BLR community as a subscriber. Your subscription makes you a patron of the arts, nurturing the writing you heard today, and helps us to continue to bring new voices to the table. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next event.